Welcome to Washington Watch with Congressman Walter Jones. Each month, we take a look at the events happening in Washington, D.C. and how they affect our lives here in Eastern North Carolina. And now, here's your Congressman, Walter Jones.
Welcome to the August edition of Washington Watch. I'm very pleased today that our guest, Bruce Fein, is a well-known, notable constitutional attorney here in Washington, D.C. Bruce graduated from Harvard in 1972. After a coveted federal judicial clerkship, he joined the United States Department of Justice, where he served as Assistant Director of the Office of Legal Policy, Legal Advisor to the Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust, and the Associate Deputy Attorney General. Further, under President Reagan, Mr. Fein was then appointed General Counsel of the Federal Communications Commission, followed by an appointment as Research Director for the Joint Congressional Committee on Covert Arms Sales to Iran. He recently served on the American Bar Association's task force on presidential signing statements. Mr. Fein is frequently quoted in the New York Times, the Financial Times, the Washington Post, the Chicago Tribune, Newsweek, and other major national publications and television shows. He is also a principal in a governmental affairs and public relations firm, the Lichfield Group, in Washington, D.C. Bruce, it's a pleasure to have you on the August edition of Washington Watch.
Honored to be here. Thank you, Walter.
Bruce, I want the people that are watching this show to know that I have the utmost respect for you. You're a fine person, but also your intellectual ability as it relates to constitutional issues is really impressive. And I know that I'm not the only one that says that, but many other people. And Bruce, you know, I have a military district, and we've been in Afghanistan for 10 years. Of course, we went into Iraq, and I don't believe we had to go into Iraq. But you and I have had numerous conversations. I wish you would share your thoughts with those watching this show about a Congress that does not declare war anymore.
Yes, and call that an invertebrate Congress with an exception of a few members like yourself. But let me begin by explaining why the war powers was such an important issue to the Founding Fathers, because they understood that a decision by a nation to go to war is the most momentous decision it will ever make. It not only risks those lives of men and women, that last full measure of devotion, as President Lincoln stated, but it typically entails taxes, it entails secrecy, it entails a curtailment of civil liberties, and it makes what is customarily murder legal. And so a very large proportion of our Constitutional Convention and debates was about the war powers. And the Founding Fathers surveyed the scene over the last century and said it's the executive branch that goes to war unilaterally, because war brings the executive branch the power, the secrecy, the footprints in the sands of time. And therefore they said, we do not want one person or a group of persons to take us into war. Only Congress can authorize the initiation of warfare. And that idea was enshrined in Article 1, Section 8, Clause 11. When they were debating this particular provision, it says only Congress can declare war, they altered the initial language, which was Congress can make war to declare war, and explained the President needs to respond to actual attacks, repel attacks like Pearl Harbor. But otherwise, in situations like Libya or Iraq, where you don't have any responsiveness to an actual attack on the United States, only Congress could decide to go to war. And that was the traditional way in which we operated for the first 75 years. President Washington said, I can't even undertake offensive measures against the Indians without Congress authorizing it. President Jefferson had 10 congressional authorizations to go and use the military against the Barbary pirates. 10. He said, even short of war, any offensive use of the military requires congressional authorization. James Madison, the father of the Constitution, went to Congress, asked for a declaration of war to fight the War of 1812 because the British were basically kidnapping our seamen and intercepting our ships illegally. So you had even the first war, Mexican-American War. We actually had a declaration of war by Congress, although it was somewhat tainted by the fact that the president at the time, James K. Polk, lied about American soldiers being killed on American soil when that wasn't true. And the opponents of voting for the war, John Quincy Adams, the former president, and Abraham Lincoln at the time. But anyway, that's the background. So when we talk about the war powers, it's not just an academic exercise. The Founding Fathers insisted, no, only the people's representatives have that neutrality of outlook that will make their decision to go to war even-handed. The president's going to be biased in favor of war because he gets all of the power. And now, ever since, really, beginning with the Mexican-American War, there's been a tendency, as the United States has grown in strength militarily, to have an attitude of empire, to have Congress recede into the background, if you will. I call it oftentimes playing an ink blot. Well, the president unilaterally would use the military for ways in which the congressional authorization was required, but the Congress would not respond. Or they would go ahead and authorize things that were based upon lies or deceit by the President of the United States. And it began to become chronic around 1900, where there were interventions in Central America. You know, we intervened in Colombia or Panama to build the Panama Canal. We were going into Nicaragua. We were going into Haiti, the Dominican Republic. Unilateral acts of the military without congressional authorization by the presidents. But then it began to become routine after World War II, when we clearly were the superpower of the world. We had defeated the Nazis, the Japanese, were the sole nuclear power after Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And the first glaring example, Walter, was the Korean War. Right. President Truman then described it as a police action, you know, a police action. Tens of thousands of troops fighting the Chinese that entered into the war, a police action. And that was a betrayal, because when the United Nations entered, the United States entered the United Nations in 1945, the president at the time was Truman. He said, I still need to come to Congress to get authorization to go to war, to use the U.S. military in an offensive way. And when the Security Council of the UN, after the North Korea invaded South Korea, authorized the use of the military, Truman did not come to Congress for an authorization to war. He just unilaterally sent American men and women abroad to die in that particular endeavor. And really, ever since then, the War Powers Clause has been in recession, if you will, and presidents have unilaterally gone to war, whether it was in Vietnam. There was the Gulf of Tonkin resolution, but that wasn't a congressional declaration of war. It was just Congress saying, Mr. President, you decide whether to go to war or not. And then we had President Clinton, who went to war in Bosnia and Kosovo. He came, as you may know, to Congress asking for a declaration of war. Congress said no. He said, well, I'll do it anyway. And now the most recent example is Libya, where despite the fact we have a war powers resolution and it was clear we're not responding to any imminent attack by Colonel Gaddafi in Libya, the president simply says, I'm doing it on my own. I'm going to try to save civilian lives, which is almost an oxymoron. You go to war to save civilian lives? No, civilians die in wartime. It's not the other way around. And then he goes further and he says, not only is Libya unique, but I, as president, in the name of regional stability, can go anywhere in the world to use our military. I said, regional stability? Is that Syria, Iran, Korea? I said, there are 100 countries standing in queue to be attacked under that theory. I say, so the precedent most recently established in Libya, it will lie around like a loaded weapon. Any occupant of the White House now, if Congress doesn't respond, and we've urged it to do something, if Congress doesn't respond, we'll say, I can use the military wherever I want, whenever I want, on my say-so alone. And what makes it even more egregious in Libya than some of the other previous unilateral wars is that Congress has not even authorized a penny for this particular exercise. He's drawing on counterterrorism funds in Libya. Well, where's the terrorism directed at the United States in Libya? He can't find any. So anyway, we're kind of reaching this high water mark of contempt or scorn from the Constitution, which has been the symbol of our country for over 2 centuries.
Well, Bruce, that's part of my concern. We had two bills, one by Republican, one by Democrat, to really zero out any funding for the Libya action taken by Mr. Obama unless Congress came back and voted up or down. We should go, we should not go. And that's been one of my disappointments, quite frankly, is I don't know where the willpower of the Congress is when it comes to war. Whether it be Korean War or Iraq War or Libya, it just seems like we have allowed ourselves to be put on a neutered in a way. I mean, we just don't take any action.
Well, I think that's exactly right, Walter. I'm not exactly sure what the explanation is, but these kinds of issues simply don't lend themselves to litigation. Even though litigation can form an important educational role. I know you're involved in the lawsuit against the president over Libya, but before it gets to the Supreme Court, years will elapse. Yeah. He may not even be in the White House anymore. And the Founding Fathers anticipated that the remedy for this usurpation of the war power would be impeachment. I know it has a ring that frightens people. They think about Clinton and Monica Lewinsky or whatever. But the Founding Fathers crafted the impeachment clause specifically, in their own words, to prevent subversions of the Constitution. That's what high crime and misdemeanors. A subversion of the Constitution. And if you just take the most important power in all of the Constitution and grab it from one branch to another, that is a subversion of the Constitution. And I wrote at the time that I initially began to criticize the Libyan intervention that the next step is the president saying, I can spend and tax on my own. I don't need to go to Congress. And we've already heard about in this debt crisis matter, well, maybe the president unilaterally can decide to raise the debt ceiling. He can spend it on his own. Or maybe then he can tax on his own. So we're already pushing that point of the constitutional pendulum that far. And it began with the war powers issue. And if Congress is not going to stand up and defend its own powers, I don't see how court is going to save it. And it's really a matter of the American people. They've got to scream and yell and say, unless you defend your prerogatives, we don't want to elect wallpaper to go sit in an office. We want somebody who will actually exercise the prerogatives the Constitution assigns to that branch.
Well, Bruce, that brings me to the point that there was so much outrage about Vietnam. People out here, of course, we had the draft in place, which we don't now. That is a partial factor for sure. But it's amazing to me we're spending $10 billion a month in Afghanistan. It's borrowed money, borrowed from the Chinese, Japanese, and UAE, I guess. And yet Congress still continues to keep 100,000 troops over there. And I just wondered, and you're such a brilliant person, I've just wondered where is the outrage anymore? Demand Congress. Congress, why don't you get our troops home? And I've had great relationships, still do, with generals who are active duty and retired, and in private conversations. And they say to me, good guy, we've killed bin Laden, he's gone. That's why we went in there. We reduced the number of al-Qaeda in Afghanistan. Of course, they're around the world, elsewhere, including Pakistan. But the point is, for the American people, it just seems like the war, unless it hits your family, which it would down in my district because of 3 bases. But with everybody else, it just doesn't seem to be at the forefront.
I think, Walter, you hit the point on the head. There's no draft anymore. Because if we look at the stratum of society, and I don't want to overgeneralize, that enlists, it typically is the voiceless, powerless, penniless. Now, there are exceptions, to be sure. But in terms of generating a political dynamic that's going to say we've had it, what are we sending our men and women abroad to die for? Because you remember, we can go back to Vietnam, and John Kerry, who now sits as chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, said when he was not in the Congress at the time and he was testifying about Vietnam, he says, who's going to explain to that last soldier in Vietnam what he died for? And no one had an answer. We can ask, but today's the same. Who's going to explain that last of our soldiers who gave the most precious thing someone can give to their country, their life? Why did you die? And we have the obscenity, and I know that's a hard word, that we do not even have a commander-in-chief who can define what victory is. He says it's degrade the enemy. That's not every military man knows that's not a definition of victory. If you can't even define why you're there, you shouldn't be risking our men and women and spending this tax dollars.
Well, if Congress is not going to hold any oversight, you had helped me with the bill 2 or 3 years ago that we did get a hearing on. That's as far as it went. But where is the responsibility, or do you see a responsibility for Congress to look into whether a war was justified or not justified?
Well, of course Congress has an obligation to do that. In part, it's to honor those who made the sacrifices. Honesty and truth has its claim, independent of politics. And secondly, it's try to utilize the past to try to prevent the same folly from occurring in the future. And you can't do that with blindness. You got to know what happened, how can we correct that? That's why I think it's so critical that we examine what was the deceit, what were the dynamics in the decision-making process that we want to prevent from happening in the future, so we don't have decisions made upon, wrongful intelligence. Sometimes it's maybe manufactured intelligence or not. We know with regard to so-called curveball, he says, yeah, I told lies. I knew I was telling lies and I wanted to get into Iraq, so I told them. We need to have a system that filters that out, because we know if I was a foreigner and I was living under some kind of tyranny, I'd say, great, if I can get the United States to come and rescue me and I don't have to pay any money and it's their lives that are at risk, I'll tell all the lies in the world because I'd hate my ruler. And I don't want to necessarily condemn the sentiment, because no one wants to live under a tyranny. But the United States is the United States. And we have an obligation to make ourselves a perfect union, to defend ourselves, and that's what the role of the government is. If individuals want to volunteer and win Nobel Prizes and that kind of stuff, that's up to them. But the United States government should not be coercing our citizens, taking our tax money to defend somebody else's freedom. It's not our moral obligation. We didn't create the problem there. Those are the kinds of humanitarian efforts that individuals can undertake. And the reason isn't because we're callous, but we know the government always acts with ulterior motives. We say that we're just doing that for humanitarian purposes. We know that's not true. We say, well, we're really in Libya just because we want to save citizens. No, but really it's because we don't like Gaddafi. And he did terrible things at Pan Am 07. And maybe we'll have some other, we don't trust the government's altruism. That's why we got to keep our government, protect us. Don't tell us we need to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy.
Well, I wish that, you and I have talked about this many, many times, that the Congress would meet its oversight responsibility. It just doesn't seem to want to do it. It's usually because of politics. It's a Democratic president, and they don't want to do it. It's a Republican president, and they want to do it. Yet the British, and we've only got a few minutes left, but the British, as you know, they held a commission, and I don't know if they subpoenaed Tony Blair, but they wanted to find out if Tony Blair told the truth about the need to go into Iraq or not.
Well, that is absolutely right. And there's no reason why we shouldn't do that today, because our separation of powers gives Congress even greater moral and legal authority to demand accountability. And this is not unique. I remember in Washington, we had a president of the United States at the time. He appeared before the House Judiciary Committee. His name was President Ford, and he explained the Nixon pardon, because at least with regard to the importance of the country, it was thought necessary to give a full accounting of what went into his decision to pardon Nixon. So it's not like the world is going to collapse if the president testifies. There's no reason why George Bush or Mr. Obama shouldn't be called. Why are we in Libya? Why did we go into Iraq? Where's all this intelligence? You said it was a slam dunk. You were saying you had all this absolutely uncontradicted information about weapons of mass destruction and whatever. And you need to answer. If you're going to serve this country and you're going to lead the country, then you have to have the courage to respond to the oversight that lets the American people have a full assessment of what you did and why.
Well, Bruce, along the lines of curveball, I saw in The Guardian where Colin Powell had said that if he had known what the purpose of going that curveball, the lie that he told the American people, that he, Colin Powell, would never go on the United Nations, asking for the support of the United Nations to go into Iraq. But, Bruce, we've got about a minute and 33 seconds. Again, I want the people to know how honored I am to have a man of your intellectual ability, especially as it deals with history of this country, but also the Constitution, to be on the show.
Yeah, and what we really have to come together, Ben Franklin, if we don't hang together, we hang separately. And you put your finger on it, Walter. The loyalty now in Congress and the Senate is to the political party. But when you're sworn in, and when I was sworn in at the executive branch, I took one loyalty, to the Constitution of the United States. Sure, there's going to be some element of partisanship, but on these large issues, surely with regard to war and peace and the rule of law, there's only one political stripe, there's only one religion, there's only one race: American.
Well, Bruce, I want to thank you again. We're going to break in just a second so Glenn Downs can come on the show. But, Bruce, I hope the people watching this show have enjoyed it as much as I have. And, every time I meet with you or we have reasons to have meetings, I'm always feel like I've been enlightened so very, very much. And thank you again, Bruce, for being on this show. And to those of you watching in just about another minute, Glenn Downs, my chief of staff, will be on the show. We're going to talk about some local issues for about 5 or 6 minutes. But thank you for watching. You've had an opportunity to see one of the great minds here in Washington, D.C. And thank you again, Bruce.
Thank you, Walter.
Welcome back. Glenn, it's good to have you. Glenn Downs, my chief of staff, and we'll talk about some of the issues facing the district, the 3rd District, but also our state and nation. So, Glenn, short period of time, but here we are.
Well, thank you once again for having me, Congressman, and we'll get right at it if we can, because the people of the Eastern North Carolina is always very vocal about expressing their opinions, which is good, and the opinions, as we're taping here today, are dealing mostly with this issue of the federal debt. The rising federal debt, federal spending, taxes, the economy, what's going on, what's going forward, and a lot of questions there. I thought it would be instructive if you could let people know, to begin with, how we sort of got here. You've been talking for a while with David Walker, the former Comptroller General of the United States, about promises that were being made, and now the bills for those promises are coming due. Talk a little bit about how we got here.
Well, Glenn, if you remember, at one time we had a Republican House and Senate, and President Clinton was in the White House, and Newt Gingrich, the Speaker of the House at the time, and the Senate leader, they were able to find a common ground to start reducing the growing debt and deficit. And actually, when President Clinton left office, we were on the way to having a surplus. And then the Bush administration and now the Obama administration both started expanding and spending, and that's really where we are today. And we're in a heck of a bad situation.
Well, for instance, when I went to school, there was no federal Department of Education. Everybody went to public schools in North Carolina, but when I graduated from high school, there was no federal Department of Education. But today, there is one. And once upon a time, the Republicans talked about actually eliminating it and going back to the future. What happened instead of that?
Well, No Child Left Behind. The current speaker, who I have a lot of respect for, and I like, at that time, he was the chairman of the education workforce, and they drafted the No Child Left Behind, which President Bush wanted for the education system. And, of course, Mr. Boehner worked with Senator Kennedy, who's now deceased, and I didn't vote for it, by the way, but No Child Left Behind was an expansion of the Federal Department of Education into state education. I am not for a Federal Department of Education. If we had an up-down vote today, I'd vote to eliminate the Federal Department of Education because, quite frankly, I think state education departments can do a much better job than the federal.
Well, in addition to that, there have been some expansion of entitlement programs like the Medicare prescription drug program, which was very expensive, but there was no new revenue brought in to fund it. And then now we have baby boomers retiring, and it's something like 10,000 a day going on Medicare. And so now we're at $14.5 trillion worth of debt, and the question is about what to do going forward. Money's going out a lot faster than it's coming in, and people are trying to figure out, where would start off with what would Walter Jones cut? I know you and Bruce Fein talked about $10 billion a month being spent over in Afghanistan. Is that?
Well, I'd start bringing our troops home as soon as possible. As soon as it was feasible, I should have said it that way. It's just the reality that at one time we were a strong manufacturing base as a country. We've lost most of that. For too long, we have been trying to police the world. It is time to police America by rebuilding jobs in this country, by taking care of the infrastructure in this country, and stop all these free trade agreements that I am opposed to, by the way. So therefore, and the Department of Education, it could be eliminated. And these are the kind of things that, with the right leadership in the White House, we could start doing these things. And no, it wouldn't change overnight, but if you know you're on the right road for correction, then you can feel good about being on the right road for correction.
Well, going forward here, and as we're talking now, it's a little bit of an awkward time because Congress is making decisions in the very near future. By the time people actually see this, some of these votes will have become public about whether to raise the federal debt ceiling and under what conditions to raise the federal debt ceiling. If the federal debt ceiling was not raised at all, and the government just had to cold turkey live on the revenues that were coming in, what could be paid for? And what couldn't be paid for just on the revenues coming in now?
Glenn, there are roughly 80 million checks go out of Washington every month, and if we defaulted, only about half of those checks would be paid, and that's the simplest way I know to put it, and that's from an authority, and I'm not an authority, but it would be a very, very difficult time for this country. And of course, you've handled my financial services committee. You know what could happen to the good faith and rating of this country. So I hope by the time people are watching this show that we have gotten to some resolution. As of the taping of this show, we're not there yet.
Is it fair to say that your position would be that you would agree to raise the debt ceiling, but only under certain conditions? In other words, you begin to see substantial progress towards getting control of spending as a sort of a middle ground?
Absolutely. It would have to be the president would have to state clearly what he is willing to work with the Congress to reduce the growth of government, and it should be comparable, quite frankly. And I think that might be what Speaker Boehner is planning on presenting actually today to the House, but we have not seen it yet. Glenn, as always, that we maybe should do a whole show one time. But thank you for being on the show. I want to thank Bruce Fein again. This has been a great show. Thanks to Bruce and Glenn. And let me say to our men and women in uniform, God, please bless our men and women in uniform, and let's bring our troops home from Afghanistan as soon as possible. Thank you.
Thank you for taking the time to join us for Washington Watch.